73 AD, the Judean Desert west of the Dead Sea. Lucius Flavius Silva, commanding the Roman 10th Legion, stood at the base of a plateau rising 1,300 feet above the desert floor and studied the fortress that crowned its summit. Masada, a palace fortress complex built by King Herod the Great over a century earlier, sat atop a mountain with sheer cliffs on all sides. The fortress walls, built along the plateau's edge, added another 15 feet of height to natural defenses that seemed insurmountable. Inside those walls, approximately 960 Jewish rebels, men, women, and children, had taken refuge after the fall of Jerusalem 3 years earlier. They had food stores sufficient for years. They had cisterns holding water enough to survive the desert. They had weapons and defensible positions. Most importantly, they had a mountain that appeared unconquerable. The rebel leader, Ben-Yair, had watched Roman forces arrive months earlier and establish siege camps surrounding the plateau. He understood Roman siege doctrine. Romans would attempt to starve the defenders into submission, but Masada's provisions made that strategy unworkable. The fortress could withstand years of siege. Meanwhile, the Roman legion below suffered in desert conditions with limited water, brutal heat, and supply lines stretching back to the coast. The strategic calculation seemed obvious. The Romans would eventually give up and withdraw. No army could assault vertical cliffs. No siege engines could reach a fortress 100 to 300 feet above their position. Masada was, quite literally, untouchable. What Ben-Yair couldn't imagine as he looked down at the Roman camps below was that Silva had no intention of starving out the fortress or abandoning the siege. The Roman commander planned something unprecedented. He would build a ramp up the mountain. Not a road, not a path, but a massive siege ramp of earth and stone rising from the desert floor to the fortress walls, a structure so immense that it would require moving hundreds of thousands of tons of material up a mountainside in the desert. The engineering challenge seemed impossible. The labor requirements seemed insurmountable. The timeline, months or perhaps years of construction in brutal conditions, seemed to guarantee failure before completion. The mathematics of siege engineering were being written not in conventional siege tactics, but in the systematic application of Roman determination and engineering capability to a problem that every military tradition said was unsolvable. The fortress that couldn't be starved out would be walked into. The mountain that couldn't be climbed would be bypassed by building another mountain beside it. The rebels who mocked Roman patience were about to discover that Roman engineering could accomplish anything given sufficient time, labor, and determination, and that when Romans committed to a siege, they would continue until walls fell and resistance ended, regardless of how long that required or what obstacles blocked the path. The story of how Rome built a ramp up Masada begins with understanding both the strategic situation that made the siege necessary and the specific characteristics of the fortress that made conventional siege approaches impossible. The first Jewish revolt had begun in 66 AD with Jewish rebels rising against Roman rule across Judea. The revolt was initially successful, with rebels capturing Jerusalem and defeating a Roman legion sent to suppress the uprising. Rome responded by dispatching a major military force commanded by Vespasian, who would become emperor during the campaign, and later by his son Titus. By 70 AD, Roman forces had systematically reconquered rebel-held territory. Jerusalem fell after a brutal siege that left the Second Temple destroyed and much of the city in ruins. The Jewish historian Josephus, who witnessed the siege and later wrote detailed accounts of the war, estimated over 1 million died during the Jerusalem campaign, though modern historians consider this figure exaggerated. Regardless of exact casualties, the Jewish revolt was effectively crushed with Jerusalem's fall. Most surviving rebels were killed or enslaved, but small groups of zealots continued resistance, occupying several fortresses in remote locations. Masada was the most formidable of these holdouts. The fortress had been built by Herod the Great between 37 and 31 BC as a refuge in case of revolt. Herod spared no expense in construction, creating a complex that combined defensive strength with palatial luxury. The location was chosen for its defensive advantages: a flat-topped plateau approximately 800 feet long by 900 feet wide, elevated 300 feet above the surrounding desert, with cliffs on all sides. The fortress walls ran along the plateau's edge, built of local stone and standing approximately 15 feet high, with numerous towers that added another 10-15 feet. These walls didn't need to be particularly strong because the real defense was the mountain itself. No army could climb the cliffs. No battering ram could reach the gates. No siege tower could be built tall enough to reach the walls. The fortress was accessible only by two narrow paths, the snake path on the east side and a slightly less difficult path on the west, both easily defended by small forces against large armies. The interior of the fortress complex was extensive. Herod had built two palace structures, the Western Palace for administrative functions and ceremonial purposes, and the spectacular Northern Palace, built on 3 rock terraces descending the northern face of the cliff. This Northern Palace was an architectural marvel, with each terrace containing rooms decorated with frescoes and columns connected by stairs cut into the rock face. The fortress included large storehouses for food, armories for weapons, and numerous cisterns cut into the rock to capture and store rainwater. When the Jewish rebels captured Masada early in the revolt, they found the fortress substantially intact with many provisions still stored from Herod's time. The rebels, known as Sicarii, zealots known for using concealed daggers to assassinate Roman sympathizers, established Masada as their headquarters. After Jerusalem fell, additional refugees joined the garrison, bringing the total population to approximately 960, according to Josephus, who claimed he interviewed 2 women and 5 children who survived the siege. The Roman 10th Legion arrived at Masada in either late 72 or early 73 AD. Exact timing is debated by historians. Flavius Silva commanded the legion, which comprised approximately 5,000 legionaries plus auxiliary troops and support personnel, bringing total Roman forces to perhaps 8,000, 10,000 men. The legion's initial task was establishing siege works to prevent escape and to create infrastructure for the extended operation that siege warfare required. The Roman approach to siege warfare was methodical and systematic, refined through centuries of experience conquering fortified positions across the Mediterranean and Europe. The standard procedure involved surrounding the target with siege camps, building walls and ditches to prevent escape or relief, establishing supply lines to sustain Roman forces, and then either starving the defenders into submission or constructing siege works to breach the fortifications. Roman doctrine emphasized patience and systematic progression over risky assaults that would result in heavy casualties. Silva's forces built 8 siege camps surrounding Masada's base, positioned to watch all approaches and prevent escape attempts. The camps followed standard Roman military design, square or rectangular layouts with defensive ditches and ramparts, organized internally with precise geometric arrangement of tents, command structures, and support facilities. A circumvallation wall, a continuous fortification connecting the camps and completely encircling Masada, prevented rebels from descending the cliffs at night to gather water or supplies. The archaeological remains of these siege works are extraordinarily well preserved because the desert environment has prevented significant decay. Modern visitors to Masada can still see the outlines of the Roman camps, the circumvallation wall, and most dramatically, the massive ramp. The physical evidence confirms the essential accuracy of Josephus's account, allowing historians to reconstruct the siege with unusual confidence. After establishing siege works, Silva confronted the fundamental problem: how to take a fortress sitting atop a mountain. Starvation wouldn't work. The rebels had ample provisions and water. Waiting them out would take years, while exposing his legion to harsh desert conditions with limited water availability. The Snake Path and Western Path were too narrow and too easily defended to permit assault. Building a siege tower tall enough to reach the walls, over 1,300 feet, was impossible with available materials and technology. Every conventional siege approach was blocked by the mountain itself. Silva's solution was the siege ramp. The concept was straightforward, but the execution was monumentally ambitious. Build an earthen and stone ramp from the desert floor up to the fortress walls, rising 1,300 feet at an angle shallow enough that siege engines could be rolled up to the walls. The ramp would essentially extend the mountain, providing a path where none existed. Roman siege engines at the top of the ramp could then breach the walls using conventional techniques. The location chosen for the ramp was the western approach, where a natural rocky outcrop called the White Promontory extended partway up the cliff face. This outcrop reached approximately 300 feet above the desert floor, reducing the height the ramp needed to gain to about 1,000 feet. Even with this advantage, the engineering requirements were staggering. The ramp would need to rise 1,000 feet while maintaining an angle shallow enough for troops and siege engines to climb, probably no more than 20-25 degrees. The mathematics of the ramp's construction reveal the scale of the project. To rise 1,000 feet at a 20-degree angle requires a ramp approximately 2,800 feet long, measured along the slope. The base of the ramp needed to be wide enough to provide stability for the structure and allow siege engines to operate at the top, probably 200-300 feet wide. The volume of material required can be estimated using the dimensions. Assuming a 2,800-foot-long ramp, 200 feet wide at the base, rising 1,000 feet, the total volume is millions of cubic feet of earth and stone. The actual ramp, as preserved today and measured by archaeologists, is approximately 2,300 feet long, measured along the slope, 650 feet wide at the base, and rises approximately 1,000 feet from the White Promontory to the fortress walls. The volume of material in the ramp is estimated at approximately 1,000,000 cubic meters, over 35 million cubic feet. This makes it one of the largest military engineering projects undertaken by Rome in a single campaign. The construction process required solving numerous engineering challenges beyond the sheer volume of material. The desert floor and the White Promontory provided some stone, but the quantity available locally was insufficient. Additional stone and earth had to be quarried or gathered from surrounding areas and transported to the ramp site. The material had to be carried up the ramp as construction progressed, meaning that every ton of stone added to the top required workers to climb hundreds of feet up an ever-rising slope. The structural stability of the ramp was critical. Simply piling earth and stone in a heap wouldn't work. The material would slide and collapse under its own weight or erode from wind and rain. Roman engineers designed the ramp with a core of large stones providing structural support, surrounded by smaller stones and earth, with a timber framework reinforcing the structure. The ramp was essentially a massive retaining wall built at an angle, requiring sophisticated understanding of structural engineering and material properties. The labor requirements were equally challenging. Estimates suggest that construction required moving and placing 300 to 500 cubic meters of material per day to complete the ramp within a reasonable time frame. With available tools, baskets, slings, ropes, and muscle power, each worker could move perhaps 1 to 2 cubic meters per day, considering the distances involved and the increasing height as work progressed. This suggests a workforce of 3,000–5,000 people working continuously for months. The Roman 10th Legion provided part of this labor force, but legionaries were supplemented by thousands of Jewish prisoners of war captured during the Jerusalem siege and other campaigns. Josephus explicitly states that Silva used Jewish captives for the ramp construction, forcing them to labor in full view of the rebels on Masada. This was both practical, providing the necessary workforce, and psychological warfare. The rebels watching from above saw fellow Jews being forced to build the instrument of their destruction, creating moral dilemmas about whether to attack workers who were their own people. The working conditions were brutal. The Judean Desert experiences extreme temperatures, over 100-degree Celsius during summer days, dropping to near freezing on winter nights. Water was scarce and had to be transported from distant sources. Workers laboring on the ramp faced heat exhaustion, dehydration, and physical exhaustion from moving tons of material up increasingly steep slopes. The death rate among workers was probably significant, though no records quantify casualties. The timeline for construction is debated by historians. Josephus doesn't provide exact duration. Archaeological analysis and engineering estimates suggest the project required approximately 6 to 8 months of continuous work by thousands of laborers. Some historians argue for shorter periods if workforce and work intensity were maximized. Others suggest longer periods if weather, logistics, and labor availability imposed constraints. The consensus is that construction took most of a year from initial siege works to ramp completion. As the ramp rose, the rebels on Masada watched with a mixture of disbelief and growing dread. Initially, the project seemed absurd, an impossible undertaking that would fail before threatening the fortress. As weeks passed and the ramp continued rising, that dismissal turned to concern. The rebels attempted to interfere with construction, launching projectiles at workers from the walls. Stones, spears, and arrows were fired at the Roman work crews. But the range was extreme, and Roman shields and defensive structures protected many workers. The harassment slowed construction, but couldn't stop it. The rebels attempted a more active defense by building an inner wall behind the section of fortress wall that the ramp approached. This inner wall, constructed of timber and earth, was designed to absorb the impact of battering rams better than stone walls. If Romans breached the outer wall, they would face a second barrier specifically engineered to resist their siege engines. The construction showed that the rebels recognized the ramp would eventually reach the walls and were preparing for the inevitable assault. As the ramp approached completion, Silva ordered construction of a siege tower at the ramp's summit. The tower, built of timber with iron plating for protection against fire, stood approximately 75 feet tall. Artillery engines mounted on the tower's top floor could fire down into the fortress, suppressing defender resistance. A battering ram on a lower floor would assault the wall once the tower reached its position. The tower was built in sections at the base of the ramp, then assembled and rolled up the completed sections as they were finished. The final assault began when the ramp reached the fortress walls. The exact date is uncertain, but most historians place it in April or May of 73 AD. The siege tower was rolled into position, and Roman artillery began firing into the fortress, clearing defenders from the wall section adjacent to the ramp. The battering ram commenced striking the outer wall, and after hours of steady pounding, the stones gave way, creating a breach wide enough for troops to enter. But behind the breach, stood the inner wall the rebels had constructed, the timber and earth barrier designed to absorb impacts. The battering ram proved ineffective against this flexible construction. Silva, recognizing that battering wouldn't work, ordered the wall set on fire. Roman soldiers shot flaming arrows and hurled torches until the timber ignited. Initially, wind blew flames back toward the Romans, threatening their siege tower. Then the wind shifted, driving flames into the fortress. The inner wall burned, leaving the path into Masada open. Roman forces prepared for the final assault scheduled for the following morning. The breach was complete, the walls were down, and nothing remained to prevent Roman soldiers from entering the fortress and capturing the rebels. Silva ordered his troops to rest and eat, preparing for the battle that would come at dawn. The siege that had lasted months was hours from conclusion. By conventional military logic, the rebels faced certain defeat: capture, enslavement, or execution. What happened that night remains one of history's most debated events. According to Josephus, who claimed to have learned the story from survivors, Eleazar Ben-Yair assembled the defenders and delivered speeches arguing that death with dignity was preferable to Roman slavery. He convinced the rebels that suicide was their only honorable option. The defenders killed their families, then selected 10 men to kill the rest. Those 10 drew lots to determine who would kill the other 9, and finally kill himself. When Roman troops entered the fortress the next morning, they found 960 bodies. Only 2 women and 5 children who had hidden in a cistern survived to tell what happened. The historical debate centers on whether the mass suicide actually occurred as Josephus described. Some historians question whether people would voluntarily kill themselves and their families rather than take chances with capture. Others note that mass suicide was recorded in other ancient sieges and that the Jewish tradition had examples of martyrdom. The archaeological evidence, 960 skeletons, weren't found because bodies would have been removed and buried by the Romans. Neither confirms nor refutes the account. What's undisputed is that when Roman forces entered Masada, they encountered no resistance. The fortress fell without the final battle Silva had prepared for. Whether through mass suicide, as Josephus claims, or through some other circumstance lost to history, the Jewish resistance ended. The Roman 10th Legion had achieved its objective. The last stronghold of the Jewish revolt was captured. The siege ramp had worked exactly as engineered. The ramp itself stands today as the most visible evidence of the siege. Unlike the timber siege tower or the circumvallation walls, which have largely eroded, the massive earthen ramp remains substantially intact. Modern visitors to Masada can walk up the ancient Roman ramp, climbing the same route Roman soldiers used 2,000 years ago. The ramp is one of the best preserved examples of Roman siege engineering in existence. Archaeological excavations at Masada have confirmed the essential accuracy of Josephus's account of the siege. The 8 camps, the circumvallation wall, and the ramp all exist as described. Artifacts found in the fortress include coins, pottery, weapon points, and personal items that provide context about daily life during the siege. The excavations in the 1960s, led by Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin, became a matter of national significance for Israel, with Masada serving as a symbol of Jewish resistance and sacrifice. The engineering lessons from Masada influenced Roman siege doctrine for generations. The ramp demonstrated that given sufficient resources and determination, Romans could overcome any defensive position regardless of terrain advantages. The willingness to invest months of labor and enormous resources into a single siege sent a clear message to potential rebels. Resistance was futile because Romans would never abandon a siege, would never accept that a fortress was impregnable, would engineer solutions to any defensive obstacle. The construction techniques used at Masada, the combination of stone core, earth fill, and timber reinforcement, became standard for Roman siege ramps in subsequent campaigns. The systematic approach of establishing siege works, securing supply lines, and then methodically building whatever structures were necessary to reach and breach fortifications was refined through experience at Masada and other sieges. Roman military engineering reached a level of sophistication that wouldn't be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. The psychological impact of the Masada siege extended beyond military engineering. The image of Roman legionaries building a ramp up a mountain in the desert, continuing construction day after day for months, despite brutal conditions, became emblematic of Roman determination. The message was clear. Rome would pay any cost, endure any hardship, and spend any amount of time necessary to achieve objectives. Resistance wasn't just militarily futile, it was strategically pointless because Romans wouldn't quit regardless of obstacles. The strategic significance of capturing Masada was minimal. The 960 rebels posed no threat to Roman control of Judea. The fortress was isolated in the desert far from population centers or strategic routes. Silva could have left a small force to maintain the siege while taking his legion elsewhere to more important duties. But Rome chose to invest legion resources for months to capture an irrelevant fortress holding a handful of rebels because leaving any resistance uncrushed sent the wrong message. The siege was about demonstrating that Roman authority was absolute and that any resistance, no matter how remote or insignificant, would be crushed. The human cost of this demonstration was significant. Approximately 960 Jewish rebels died at Masada, whether by suicide or other means. Thousands of Jewish prisoners died or suffered terribly during the ramp's construction. Hundreds of Roman soldiers probably died or were incapacitated by disease, heat exhaustion, or construction accidents during the months-long siege. The expenditure of resources, food, water, materials, and time was enormous. All this was invested to capture a fortress that had no strategic value beyond symbolism. The story of Masada raises questions about proportionality and necessity in military operations. Was building the ramp worth the cost? From a narrow military perspective, probably not. The resources consumed at Masada could have been deployed more productively elsewhere. From a strategic perspective, emphasizing demonstrations of power and will, possibly yes. The message sent by Masada influenced others considering resistance to Rome. From a moral perspective, the answer depends entirely on one's position regarding imperial authority and resistance to occupation. For the Jewish defenders, Masada represented the final act of the First Jewish Revolt, a last stand by people who refused to submit to Roman rule regardless of the futility of resistance. For the Romans, Masada was a demonstration that no position was safe from Roman siegecraft, that any fortress could be taken if Romans decided to take it, and that patience and engineering could overcome any terrain advantage. Both perspectives contain truth. The technical achievement of the ramp should not be minimized by moral questions about the siege itself. The engineering that moved millions of cubic feet of earth and stone up a mountainside in the desert using ancient tools and muscle power was extraordinary. The ramp rose 1,000 feet, extended over 2,000 feet, and remained stable enough for siege engines to operate on its surface. The project required sophisticated understanding of structural engineering, materials, science, and logistics. The successful completion of construction demonstrated Roman engineering capability at its peak. The siege techniques refined at Masada would be employed by Roman forces across the empire for centuries. When Titus besieged Jerusalem in 70 AD, Roman engineers built massive siege ramps to reach the city walls. During Trajan's campaigns in Dacia in the early 2nd century, Roman engineers constructed siege works that overcame mountain fortresses. Wherever Romans encountered defensive positions that conventional assault couldn't overcome, they built engineering solutions, ramps, towers, mines, that negated defensive advantages. The fundamental principle that Masada illustrated was that static defenses, no matter how strong, could not ultimately stop determined attackers willing to invest sufficient time and resources. Walls could be climbed or breached, moats could be filled, mountains could be ascended. The fortress that seemed impregnable merely required more effort and more time to capture. This principle would influence military engineering for millennia, driving evolution of both offensive siege technology and defensive fortification design. The modern significance of Masada extends far beyond ancient military history. For Israel, Masada became a powerful national symbol after the 1960s archaeological excavations. The narrative of Jewish defenders choosing death over slavery resonated with the Israeli experience of the Holocaust and the subsequent founding of the state. The Israeli Defense Forces adopted Masada as a symbol, with some units holding ceremonies at the site. The phrase, "Masada shall not fall again," became a slogan expressing determination to defend Jewish sovereignty. This symbolic appropriation of Masada has generated historical debate about the accuracy of Josephus's account and the ethics of celebrating mass suicide. Some Israeli historians have questioned whether the suicide occurred as described or whether the story serves mythological rather than historical purposes. Others argue that regardless of exact details, Masada represents legitimate resistance to oppression. The debate illustrates how ancient events continue to shape modern identities and politics. The ramp itself, as a physical artifact, provides evidence independent of Josephus's text. The engineering is real, documented by archaeology and still visible today. Whatever happened inside the fortress on that final night, the Roman legion definitely built a massive ramp up a mountain in the desert. That achievement stands on its own as evidence of Roman engineering capability and determination. The ramp validates the core elements of Josephus's account, even if specific details about the defender's fate remain uncertain. The construction timeline and method can be partially reconstructed from the physical evidence. The ramp's core structure of large stones provided stability and strength. Smaller stones and earth filled gaps and created a surface suitable for moving siege engines. Timber reinforcements, long since rotted away but evidenced by post holes and structural analysis, prevented the ramp from collapsing under its own weight or eroding from weather. The construction was methodical and engineered, not simply a pile of dirt. The labor organization required for the project demonstrates Roman military administration capabilities. Thousands of workers, legionaries, auxiliary troops, and prisoners had to be coordinated, supplied with tools and water, supervised to maintain construction quality, and organized into shifts to maintain continuous progress. The logistics of feeding thousands of workers in the desert for months, while also supporting the legion's combat troops, required supply lines stretching back to the Mediterranean coast. The entire operation was a demonstration of Roman organizational sophistication. The psychological warfare aspects were deliberate and calculated. Forcing Jewish prisoners to build the ramp created moral dilemmas for defenders who would have to kill their own people to stop construction. The steady, inevitable progress of the ramp, climbing the mountain day after day, week after week, demonstrated Roman patience and determination in ways that would demoralize any defender. Every stone added to the ramp was a visible, tangible step toward inevitable defeat. For the rebels watching the ramp rise, the experience must have been psychologically devastating. They could see Roman progress every day. They could calculate approximately when the ramp would reach the walls. They knew that once the ramp was complete, the fortress would fall. The growing certainty of defeat, played out over months of watching construction creep upward, created conditions where mass suicide might seem preferable to waiting for the inevitable end. The Roman perspective emphasized different values: duty, discipline, persistence, and engineering excellence. Roman soldiers built the ramp because they were ordered to build it, and Roman soldiers obeyed orders regardless of difficulty. The engineering challenges were problems to be solved through systematic application of Roman technical knowledge. The desert conditions were hardships to be endured through discipline and organization. The time required was irrelevant, because Romans would continue until the objective was achieved. These values, duty, persistence, discipline, were fundamental to Roman military culture and explain how Rome conquered and held an empire spanning 3 continents. The final truth about Masada is that the fortress fell exactly as Roman engineering determined it would fall. The mountain that seemed to make Masada impregnable merely delayed capture by the months required to build the ramp. The provisions that allowed rebels to withstand years of starvation siege were irrelevant when Romans engineered a path to walk through the walls. The cliff faces that prevented conventional assault were negated by creating an artificial mountain that bypassed the natural defenses. The rebels who mocked Roman patience misunderstood what Roman patience meant. It didn't mean waiting passively for defenders to surrender. It meant continuing systematic engineering and siege operations regardless of how long completion required, regardless of what obstacles needed to be overcome, regardless of what hardships had to be endured. Roman patience was active, determined, and ultimately unstoppable. The ramp that rose 1,000 feet up a mountain in the desert proved that when Romans committed to taking a fortress, they would build whatever was necessary: roads, towers, ramps, or even mountains to achieve that objective. The mathematics weren't written in conventional siege doctrine or traditional military tactics. They were written in cubic feet of earth moved, in tons of stone carried up increasing slopes, in months of labor by thousands of workers, and in the engineering calculations that determined the ramp's angle, width, and structural design. The fortress that couldn't be starved, stormed, or conventionally besieged was conquered through systematic application of Roman engineering capability to a problem that Jewish rebels calculated was unsolvable. The mountain that protected Masada became irrelevant when Romans built their own mountain beside it, demonstrating that Roman determination combined with engineering expertise could overcome any defensive advantage nature provided. The Jews who mocked Roman patience discovered that patience, in Roman terms, meant building the impossible until it became real and the impregnable fortress fell.